We're talking to Trent McConaghy from BigChainDB. You're sort of a startup. What do you do?
Sure, so BigChainDB is a scalable blockchain database, which means it's a database that has blockchain characteristics. It's sort of the best of both worlds, of databases and blockchains, unlocking the power of blockchains with scale and queryability.
What does it mean, sort of blockchain?
Well, it is a blockchain technology, right? But in our view, blockchains, the whole promise, the technology is really databases, and we saw that there was challenges to the scale of traditional blockchains. We saw, though, in the world of databases, they've been scaling like crazy, powering the internet for a long time. So we took off-the-shelf distributed database technology that has scalability, queryability, and more, and then brought in blockchain characteristics.
Like the openness?
Yeah, the openness, so decentralized control, no single entity owns or controls it. Immutability, so once you write it, it's there for good. And assets, so assets can literally live on this substrate. So those are the three main characteristics that BigChainDB brings above and beyond traditional databases.
And how did it start?
So we started out on a project 3 years ago where we saw a problem in the world of art, specifically digital art. How do you collect digital art? And we realized, what if you could own digital art the way that you own Bitcoin? And we pulled in that thread, realized it would work. And this is back in the day, Bitcoin was a thing, but blockchain wasn't. We pulled in this thread and we realized it would work. And it was really leveraging the idea of Bitcoin and blockchain. And we built a company around that called Ascribe. And it's a web app that artists can use and so on. And so we got going with that and shipped that. And then we ran into issues of scale. We were crawling the web, indexing billions of images, and we found that Bitcoin blockchain simply didn't scale to the needs that we had. We looked around, we found that no other technologies out there had the scale, blockchain technologies, but distributed databases did. So that's where we basically reshifted our focus towards lower in the stack, this database, this blockchain database that has both scale, yet blockchain characteristics.
So could I describe your early start as sort of an artist web shop type thing, but then very modern?
Not as much of a web shop, more like PayPal, but instead of for transferring money and dollars, it's for transferring IP. So establishing that you have copyright over an item and then transferring some of those rights from person A to person B. So you could use it as a web app. We also have an API. And we have a lot of users. There's about 5,000 artists using the platform and a couple dozen organizations that are using our API for various things, people who have started companies on top of this and so on. And we think it's still of great value overall for making it really easy to wire IP, to make it as easy to send IP, intellectual property, make it as easy as sending an email. But like mentioned, there was the challenge of scale, and that's what led us down the path towards BigChainDB.
Right. So the letter of certificate of intellectual property that comes with a physical art piece, that's what you distributed. And now you went, after your pivot, you're more into the database level. And what are your customers then on the database after the pivot?
Sure, so obviously we're using the database, we're moving towards using the database for Ascribe, but we're working with a lot of different companies and organizations and a whole variety of verticals. There's 6 key verticals, that is intellectual property, identity, things like sovereign personal data, identity assurance, banking and finance. Throw a rock, you'll find an application in that one, energy, government, and supply chain. So in those different verticals, there's several organizations that we're working with. For example, in government, there's a company called BenBen that's doing a land registry in Ghana, right? So that's one example there. Another example is...
So they would register pieces of land in a database, which is your database, and that's a government entity.
Yeah, well the challenge is governments often play the role of registries, right? But what if a government undergoes a military coup? Or it becomes corrupt. And that's really a problem in a lot of nations of the world, right? So if you have some sort of immutable record of who owns what, such as land, then there's a lot of value. We actually saw this in Crimea, where once Russia took over Crimea, all the titles to the land were burned. That's terrible. There's some people who lost generations worth of land in an instant because of this. So when you have this thing on a blockchain where no single entity owns or controls this solves that issue, right?
Very interesting. Do you have some other of these examples?
Yeah, sure. So energy is a big one. Energy, it's $1 trillion industry, trillion plus. And a big thing is happening, deregulation. And deregulation is basically the middlemen are going away. It used to be these big utilities, often government spun out, where they were connecting the energy producers, even being the energy producers, connecting to the consumers, whether it be houses or businesses, factories, and so on. But in deregulation, anyone can connect to anyone. But then, how do you actually transfer value? How do you collect euros for electrons? This is where blockchain can come in. It can be that connector of who owns what electrons, who owns what dollars, in a way where no single entity is owning or controlling it. So we're working very closely with RWE, that's Germany's largest electric utility. We're working very closely with them on a number of projects towards basically overall deregulation. Actually deregulation, it's an existential threat for them, right? They're used to being the middleman, but they're being thought leaders on this, getting ahead of it, and instead helping to design the future of energy.
And identity?
In identity, there's two main subparts. One of them is sovereign personal data, and the other one is assurance. So in the problem of sovereign personal data, that's the solution. The problem is things like social media networks, like Facebook, or where your reputation is on things like Uber and so on. Every single platform stores a bunch of your data. But wouldn't it be better if you could actually control all of it yourself, having it stored, encrypted, etc., on some substrate that no one controls, and then you doling out just tiny pieces of that to different organizations over time as they need, just the right amount to Facebook with your permission.
And you can retract it.
Exactly, and you can retract it. So instead of these walled gardens and data silos that we have right now, you're actually controlling your data. So blockchains enable this whole concept of sovereign personal data, which is actually really how it should be. And we're working with various companies towards this. We can't talk about them, unfortunately, they're too early stage.
But can you talk about what type of identification companies they are, or what the purpose is?
Yeah, so for example, things like social networks or sovereign personal data, right? So it's really helping to provide this infrastructure towards creating the applications, and in some cases the applications themselves. The other part of identity is assurance. So how does someone else know who you are, who you say you are, right? And there's a lot of applications. One example is in banking with simple things like know your customer, KYC, so that the bank knows who you are for loans and all this, even to giving you an account. And we're working with some companies on that for assurance. There's other examples where you actually might lose your papers. Maybe you're a refugee from one of these corrupt countries. You end up, at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, and you're a medical doctor. You want to feed your family, but you don't have any papers that say you're a medical doctor, right? One example there is establishing your credentials in some rock-solid way. So we're working with Recruit Technologies, which is a large Japanese conglomerate, billion-dollar conglomerate, where HR and credentials are their main thing. So we're working with them on a pilot project towards immutable HR credentials.
So let's say I have a good idea around that. I work for a company. How do I start?
Yeah, so first of all, just brainstorm a lot. There's lots of ideas. Learn a lot. There's lots of documentation and books out there. There's a lot of excellent books by people like Don Tapscott, Melanie Swan, and so on to help you explore this. I'll be giving a talk shortly that gives tools to explore this too. One way is think about the 6 verticals I mentioned: identity, IP, finance, energy, government, and supply chain, and then think about the 3 main benefits that blockchain might give, which is immutability, decentralized control, and that's really a political tool, and the idea of assets, which enables really low-cost exchanges with low friction. So any one of those verticals crossed with any one of those benefits can lead to new opportunities. And there's sub-verticals too. Within IP, you've got music, you've got ebooks, you've got comics, all of these. There's a lot of opportunity out there. So generate the ideas, and then think about them, and then actually, for every 10 ideas we see, 8 of them you can solve with a traditional database. So that's really useful to understand. So try to find someone who's thought about a blockchain for a while and just vet them. Feel free to come to us, right? I'm Trent at BigChainDB.com. Email me, right? Or follow me on Twitter, ask me, or ask any of us. And we'll be happy to tell you if your idea has merit or if you should keep exploring.
Nice, interesting.